What's up, guys? Today we're going to be doing some moss pole stuff. I've got this philodendron that I keep forgetting about that my buddy Mick sent me, and I need to put that on a moss pole. And then I've got a handful of other plants that have reached the end of their moss poles, so those will be chopped and propped essentially and reset on the base of a new moss pole. So I'll be able to show you how I set my moss poles up, like from scratch, from an empty one, and put a small climbing species on it. And I'll also be able to show you the benefits of a moss pole, like when a plant has actually grown all the way up, and how well developed the root system is and how mature the plant has developed. But real quick, I wanted to show you the moss poles I'm going to be using. These are the moss poles that I make myself. This is vinyl gutter downspout. You can see it looks like a gutter and it's been painted. This is an old one that I painted the inside of. Don't do that because the roots stick to the paint. It's not good. You want to, like in your mind it makes sense, you know, paint the inside as well because it'll hide the white. It's not a good idea. The moss will hide the white eventually. But yeah, it's just vinyl gutter downspout cut to length and then split in half long ways. And then there's hardware mesh, plastic hardware mesh. I'm looking at the screen, sorry. And then you fill it with moss. I zip tie mine to the back of the pot because I like to hang mine. I have these little, I drill holes in the top right there. You can see that hole. And then I hang it like that from a hook, and it saves a lot of space. You can see all the ones behind me in my tent. But yeah, this is extremely effective. This is, in my opinion, the best moss pole option in existence. It takes a lot of time and stuff to build. These are kind of a pain in the ass. But there are options out there that you can buy. So the options that you could buy would be like the clear D-shaped moss poles where it's like you fold it basically and lock the back tabs in and it's got a front whole thing. The downside to those is basically you're not gonna be able to stack them very high. I'd say maybe 4 or 5 feet, maybe, if you have a support stake. These are a little bit more rigid so you can stack them. But those would be the second best option out there. There's a lot of old school methods that people are still using, like the hardware mesh just in a circle. That's what I used to do. That was my entire collection was on that for a long time. I don't use those anymore because they're not as good. And then I'm going to just attach a picture of the worst possible method in existence. The PVC pipe with the coconut coir wrapped around them. That is just a PVC pipe decorated with a little bit of coconut coir. It does nothing for a climbing species. You can stake it. There's no difference between staking attaching your plant, your climbing species, to that thing, and attaching your climbing species to a frickin' bamboo pole or something, like something super. It doesn't help at all. They're useless. They're the worst possible thing you can buy for your plant. Nothing is going to root into that unless you water it 5 or 6 times a day. Or if you're down in Florida and it's just extremely muggy and wet all the time, then something will root into it. But for a normal person who's trying to grow plants in their house or in their grow tent, they are the worst product, period. I was the director of horticulture at a plant store for 3 or 4 years. We sold them. I was always telling the owners, can we please not sell these? I hate selling these. I hate these as a product. And they were like, people buy them, so we have to, and I understand that. But we would always disclose to people how they're used and how they are different from an actual moss pole. It is a glorified support stake. If you need something to physically support, like a big monstera, sure, use one. But if you want something your plant to climb up something and mature, like this plant is, you can see these little teeny leaves down here, all this stuff, and these giant mature foliage up here. That's what happens when a plant has the ability to mature and to actually climb on a proper moss pole. And that's not going to happen with the coconut coir ones. So, I'll just drop that there. That'll leave that tangent alone. I hate those things so much. But moving on. So basically, I've got the moss pole real quick, already zip tied up there. You can see the zip tie on the back. I've got to put this philodendron on one, and then I've got to pull a rhaphidophora off another one. So I'm going to zip tie the hardware mesh real quick into these side holes that you can you see if I get the light right? Alright, so you can see I've got the hardware mesh all zip tied into place, and I've got my little philodendron. as a new species from Peru. It doesn't yet have a name. It was collected by an anaconda researcher, actually. So a couple of us have it. We need to grow it out, see if it blooms and ends up being something that looks familiar, but it might be a new species, so that's fun. A little bit of roots there. Plenty to throw on a moss pole, and I'll be able to secure these aerial roots, or at least these ones, these upper aerial roots, onto the moss pole directly. Planting these guys does take a little bit of finesse because you've got the whole moss pole to worry about, so I'm going to throw some substrate in the pot. Get this guy situated. You'll notice I'm using a chunky mix. All of the water from the pole is going to drain into the pot due to gravity, so you want to make sure you have good drainage there. Also, stop looking at my armpits. That shirt is ripped. I know, I'm sorry. And that's good, that's ready for moss. And I always hear people asking, you know, when should I put my plant on a moss pole? When is it ready for a moss pole? As soon as you physically can put it on a moss pole, put it on a moss pole. The only limitation is whether the plant is like big enough to physically lean it up against the pole, and you can throw a zip tie or something. Not a zip tie. And you can throw a Velcro strap around that stem and get it to root in, because once the plant's rooted into the moss pole and it feels that, it's going to climb up it on its own. There are a handful of plants that like to slowly drift away from the moss pole as they climb, and they're a pain, like Patriciae or Fibrocataphyllum, stuff like that. But for the most part, the plants, as soon as they feel that pole, they're going to climb straight up it. So as soon as you can get a plant on a pole, put it on a pole. Don't wait. And like I was saying, if you do have a little bit longer of a stem, it can help a lot to, because you saw me kind of struggling to hold the plant in place, hold the pole in place, hold the pot in place as I'm adding soil. If you have a longer stem, start off by Velcroing it to the moss pole, and then you don't have to hold the plant there. You can just fill the soil around the root system and not necessarily worry about it that much. So I'm going to go ahead and add the moss, and then we're good. Alright, so that little philodendron is doing good there, and you can see I didn't fill up the moss all the way. That's fine. I didn't have enough moss on hand. I'm soaking more right now. I'm going to leave it like that, and I'm going to use this moss that I'm soaking now for repotting this guy. This is a plant that I got pretty recently. You can see, actually, you can do like a forensic whole thing on this thing. It's really cool to watch plants develop on moss poles, because you can see exactly where they are along the time, or along the whole thing. It's like a timeline. I got this plant pretty long. It was already almost at the end of the moss pole, and I knew it was going to have to adjust for a while. So you can see exactly what was going on. So it came to me with all these big leaves, and then this long runner stem. It had one little leaf, runner node, and then it finally adjusted to my conditions, pushed, you can't really see it from here, but it pushed like one more node, and then it pushed this little teeny tiny leaf. And then we're back to 1, 2, 3, 4, and then it reached the end of that moss pole. So we need to repot this guy. I'll probably take a top cut right around here, repot this, and then split up all of these, share those with my friends, because this is not a plant that is easy to come by, so a lot of my friends are trying to get a piece of it. But yeah, so I'm going to break this moss pole down. I'll show you how that's done, and you'll get a good idea of why you want to be using moss poles. Alright, so the first thing I always do, where are my little thingies, is pop off the pot. Because we have two different types of media here. We've got an aroid mix in here, and we've got a sphagnum mix, or just sphagnum moss in here. I reuse all my sphagnum moss because it's a limited resource. It's not the most, it is a renewable resource, but it takes time, so you want to make sure you're not wasting this stuff, in my opinion. Just because I'm an environment nerd. So I always pop the pot off first. And then we're going to knock off as much of this soil as we can. Alright, so now a little bit of moss is starting to fall out. I'll just toss that in there. And this is old soil. Organic soils tend to degrade over time. This isn't a very old soil mix, so actually, glad I mentioned that. Good thing I was thinking out loud with that. If this is a plant that you've had in the pot for a long time, I would recommend tossing this, or at least baking it to kind of restart the cycle of organic breakdown and decomp. Since this has only been on this pot for a few months, I'm going to put this back into my other soil mix, this big thing right here, and we'll reuse this. Alright, so now that I've cleaned out all this soil, I have a nice place to put all my sphagnum moss that I can recycle without having to dirty it up. So next up, you're just going to snip off all of these zip ties. That's the only thing I don't like about building moss poles like this. I feel like I'm wasting plastic. And realistically, now that I'm looking at it, that's a teeny tiny bit of plastic, but I'm wasting so many zip ties when I do this. I wish there was a good way to like cinch these guys down that was reusable. Alright, and then there's a few ways to go about this, but it's mainly just you gotta be careful. And this goes back into earlier when I was talking about don't paint the inside of the pole. See how this is, you can see the white there? This is unpainted. A lot of times you can literally just slide this whole thing out. This one's not gonna do it. But you just have to very, very, very carefully kind of wiggle and try to move this whole root system out of this pole. It's not terribly difficult, you just want to be careful. Obviously, slower you go. Oh, there we go. And there we go. That's an empty moss pole, and this is one of those rare cases where you get the entire thing out intact. And I'm sure you can see, this is the main reason we use these moss poles. Look at that root system. Look at all that. That's nuts. That is, this whole thing, this entire thing is rooted. So you don't have to worry about rooting cuttings, you don't have to worry about dealing with any of that. The moss pole does it all. The only downside now is that you gotta be very careful about untangling all this. So this is gonna be very time consuming. We'll cut to when I'm done. Alright, and 9 hours later, it is very time consuming, so don't let that, you know. Be aware of that. It is very time consuming. This is what we're left with. You see that? That's the top. And look at all of these roots. A lot of them are near the base. I mean, these are near the middle. These big, big roots. Obviously, the older roots are more developed. But I'm very comfortable taking a top cut right about here is what I'm going to do. Because, I mean, I could take a top cut, you know, as far up as I want. But I like to maintain the maturity, so I do lower top cuts typically. Because it stresses the plant out less. And like I was saying, this is a very, very tedious process to remove all of this moss. But if you look, that's a lot of moss. It's a good bit of moss. And these right here are, if I can grab them all, these are all the broken roots. These are the roots that I broke trying to get that moss out of there. A beginner is going to break a lot more. This is years and years of practice with these moss poles. And there's even a little bit more right here that I missed. But expect to break some roots. It's not a big deal. It's the same thing with a normal plant. You know, with a normal plant, you take a top cutting, you're going to activate growth points lower below. It's the same thing with roots. You're going to activate spreading of root systems if you chop a big taproot or something like that. So it's not a huge deal. As long as you have enough roots, losing a few isn't going to hurt anything. I used to try to maximize the amount of propagation I could get, so I do, you know, every single node. But I don't do that anymore. I prefer quality over quantity. I want to make sure the people I'm selling to get nice, good, you know, big cuttings, healthy cuttings that are stable, that are not going to give them any trouble, and, you know, I'm selling fewer stuff and having to worry about fewer things. So I'm probably going to get 4 cuttings out of this whole thing. I could get, you know, there's 17 nodes on this. I could get 17 cuttings if I wanted to. Just because that's the amount of roots that are on this thing, I'm probably going to get like 3 or 4. I'm going to keep my top cut for myself and have 2 or 3 base cuts with this massive amount of roots. I'll wait till those push a few leaves and those will get sent off to my friends. But yeah, and then basically once I cut this, I'll cut it probably right about right there. I'll have this top cut right here, and that'll go back on a moss pole the same way I did that philodendron. So that's pretty much it. You know, that's what you do. You'll cut these guys, you know, just like this. You throw this back on the base of a moss pole, and it continues to climb, and then you maintain that maturity without stressing it out too much. So if this was just, you know, something that wasn't on a moss pole, it would have to root, and it would go through a lot of stress, and then it would start to grow again, and you would lose the progress you've made with maturing that plant. Depending on the species, it can take a lot of time and a lot of feet to climb, as in like elevation-wise. I've heard of, you know, Monstera barrieri or barrieri, something like that, barrieri, having to climb 30 or 40 feet on moss poles before it even begins to mature. Philodendron melanochrysum is a classic one where you'll get stagnation, where the plant sizes up and it'll produce leaves that are 6 to 7 inches long, and then it'll just maintain that leaf size for like 4 or 5 iterations of moss poles of keeping that top cut, letting it climb up, keeping that top cut, letting it climb up, and then eventually it'll size up or something like that. But it's something you have to kind of mess with. Sometimes it's just changing a factor, changing lighting, changing fertilization, changing something. But this is the best way to grow climbing plants, in my opinion, by far. But yeah, that's pretty much it. I'm going to throw this guy in a moss pole, get some stuff cleaned up, and be done for the day. So thank you guys so much for watching. If you have any questions about anything, please drop them in the comment section. And hopefully I'll see you guys next time.